Okay, guys, welcome to this week's edition of the KinFitz & Co Sales Huddle. Again, for those that haven't joined us before, welcome. What we're trying to achieve at KinFitz & Co is to create a sales community that can help solve problems, challenges, objections, and to really grow as a community, especially within 2020 and the challenges that it has brought us so far. And just thank you to all those that have come in week out and that have seen the huddle before. It's great to see you again, and hopefully we've got a lot of value that we can add to you today in all things culture. So the intention of today's huddle is to assess the importance of culture in sales and its focus for the remainder of 2020. So I'm sure for some of us and potentially all of us in the huddle today, we're getting to the stage where the first half of this year is over or coming to an end. So it's about assessing what's happened and what we need to do to really strengthen our year for the second half. And I think it's obviously been a year that we'll never forget, and it's been a year that has really challenged, every business in the world and in any part of the world. I think for those that are in the UAE, it seems like there is a turn in the road, and it is becoming a bit more positive, what with the announcements of 100% of the private sector and leisure tourism and sort of retail moving back into what is like a full capacity sort of pre-COVID. So from what we've seen and from our perspective as a sales recruiter, there are more jobs now being advertised in the market than probably sort of 2 weeks ago. So that would suggest that companies are focusing on strengthening what is a challenging first half and really driving home a better performance in the second half of 2020. And, I'm sure for everyone who's either a manager, a C-level person, or a sales contributor in this huddle, we've probably got time and revenue to make up. So it's really important that culture is driven, and I think what Tania will discuss is, regardless of whether we are thinking about it, it is something that's been practiced in a day-to-day of our business and in our sales organization. So we usually start with an exercise. I think given that today is quite a deep topic that can affect anyone in a business, I just think we'll go with a standard Q&A. So we'll have a couple of topics that Tania and I will discuss, and then we'll have a Q&A. We'll again have another couple of topics, and then we'll have a final Q&A with Tania. So introducing Tania. So Tania originally had an operations background before she moved into the UAE. She moved into the UAE in a sales and account management position at Bayzat, who are the Middle East's #1 funded fintech startup. But she sort of swiftly rose up the ranks and moved from sort of sales and account management to a HR position, and is now working as the Senior Vice President of Organizational Development and Culture. And she's most recently added an accreditation of being a coach to her list of skills, which I'm sure will help her in her role as the main voice of culture within Bayzat. So Tania, thank you very much for being on the huddle.
Thank you for inviting.
No worries. So just before we sort of jump into culture, I mean, it would be great to understand your role within Bayzat, and mainly from a cultural side of view. I think to have a role specifically based on culture is something that you don't really hear of. So it'd be great to understand your roles and responsibilities based solely on culture within your company.
Thank you for the question. So my responsibilities are quite diverse, I would say. So I think they are not limited to a particular function or particular area, and they involve anything that I see on organization level, any activities that I see that will create an impact for us to adhere to our culture. So I think the first step there is understanding the company's culture, and then seeing, okay, what are we lacking and how we get on track with that. And that gives me the incredible opportunity to pretty much design whatever I'm doing day on day or year on year with new exciting projects. So currently what I'm working on is implementing a planning process for the company based on OKRs, which Bayzat started back in December last year. So I'm leading that process. The second big priority for me is upskilling our leadership team. So taking them through the leadership internal course, which is in-house developed, and making sure that there is there's a standard at which the leaders at Bayzat adhere to. And the third one is really trying to build a coaching culture across the organization, coaching and feedback culture, which is really part of who we are as a company.
So a lot of what you're doing right now is focusing on the leadership team and how they interact with their junior members.
Correct, yeah.
Okay. So going into like looking at culture and looking at what you're doing now versus what you've done previously, I think obviously the journey of Bayzat has grown and I'd say exploded over a short period of time, from when you joined probably being like the 30th or 40th employee to then sort of going into the 200, 300 employees. So at a time when you weren't focusing on sort of the leadership, what has culture meant and what has culture changed in your journey from when you sort of joined Bayzat to where you are now?
I think probably when back in the days when I was working in sales, I think the general understanding was the culture is something, something very tangible, something that you can see, the perks that company puts on, and, their logo and like how they interact with the public. But as you kind of work in a company, you realize actually those are not the things and they're not even as important. So for me, definition of culture is how people interact and behave when they are not being recorded. And that means like when no one is, when people are not watching, when they are not producing like marketing material for recruitment, how is the vibe, what's happening, who is talking to whom, how they are talking, how decisions are being taken, what's the seniority like, what's a succession plan is, what's the promotions like. So all those invisible things, how are decisions taken? That's what for me now means culture and forms culture.
So a lot of the work that I know you've done is by building out documentation and building out ways that your team can learn about the culture and the principles that you've sort of ingrained into the company. Does culture have to be visible, or does it have to be documented, or is it something that can organically be grown to a positive effect?
Culture happens whether people know about it or not. As long as there are two people working together, there is a culture. So any organization and every organization and group of people and a group in the university will have a culture of the group, culture of the company, culture of a team within the company. Documentation helps being intentional with it and really defining it and then taking decision based on what you want to be. It doesn't necessarily mean that you will be that company with that culture from day one. But once you have it defined and you really understand like your intentions behind it, that will help you to take decisions and also grow into it. So if you don't have it documented, it probably organically happens, but you can never guarantee whether it's intentional and whether it's the best what your company could be.
And we'll talk about controlling culture in sort of the second half, but what have you learned from becoming, working your way up in a startup that was so different to what it is today, and then moving through the culture? What have you learned now being sort of the main voice of culture within the organization?
First thing is, I think well, there are a couple of things. One, you culture, you can adopt culture, so it's not something set in stone. It's not something you put on your website and you never look for, you know, till the moment you again redesign your website. And a lot of companies unfortunately still do that, you know, putting big words, our values or our principles, but they don't really understand the meaning of it. So it can evolve, it can change, you can add things, you can remove things which no longer fits you. And especially if you're growing or you're going through massive transformation, it's very likely that your culture will change or should change. Now, in terms of the second thing is you working on culture and making sure that your culture stays at its best. It's a hard work and it requires everyone to be on board, especially the leadership team. So it's not really the role of HR per se. And no matter how much HR will try in the company where they don't have support of the CEOs and senior executive level, they usually don't succeed because it has to go from all angles in order to actually make change.
So the case is culture doesn't need to be maintained, but it needs to evolve with the way that your organization is changing and the targets and ambition that they have, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So moving into sales. So I think, you know, within sales and within my experience in sales and having been an ex-employee at Bayzat, I think the emphasis around culture probably wasn't as broadcasted as what it was been in Bayzat. And I think probably because in previous positions, it just hasn't been, not required, but everyone's been on a similar wavelength. And I think within sales, part of me within the understanding of culture is if you know right and wrong, and if you know how to sell, how not to sell, and what your company wants to sell in terms of a product, do you feel that culture is still required, or do you feel that it needs to be given as much airtime as what potentially companies are doing?
Well, I think that connects like a bit to what I covered just before is the culture happens. Now, so you need to be, so in sales, you would have a culture, and based on that culture, you either will be able to attract and retain certain types of people or not. So, and, you know, without going into too much details and differences, you could either have very collaborative culture where everyone works as a team and being part of the team and winning as a team is more important than winning as an individual. And you could have a culture, sales culture, where, you know, being winning individual is much more important and recognized, and it's almost like you competing against each other. Those two are very different cultures, and they will attract very different people. And if my preference is for the collaborative space, and I enter a company which is all about you know, winning against each other, I'm probably not going to make it in the company. So that was based on the resources. That's why it's important to be intentional about it. There's as long as you are intentional, you can then attract the right people and promote the right people, and the right people will stay in your company. And especially in sales, since sales roles are so stressful, so even so more when you're always under stress, the culture, the real culture comes out.
Yeah. So how important then is the need of culture when hiring, and the emphasis of understanding a cultural fit with a potential employee?
In my opinion, that's the number one, the most important and deciding factors for hiring, because in reality, you can teach technical skills. That's number one. And two, yes, there are some technical skills here that you need. Like you wouldn't hire someone with a psychology degree to do finance unless they took some courses and they know some basics. But in a nutshell, if you have, for me, if you have two people applying for the same role, have fairly similar experience, maybe one is more junior, one is more senior, but the junior one meets our culture requirements, like it is cultural fit, like I would go for that one. because having the right person joining the team will enrich the team, and eventually everyone will grow. Having a wrong person in the team would frustrate the team leader, the person itself who would always feel they are failing, and also the team members who's questioning the decisions leadership is making and also struggling to integrate with that person. So I think, I mean, at Bayzat, the culture fit is the first thing that we assess. If you don't see that the person is cultural fit, the person doesn't even go to the next stage of interviews, and even before the offer, we still assess through background checks to make sure that it does fit what we know about the person already.
I guess within sales specifically, I think there is a danger of being blindsided by performance. And by that, I mean, you know, a salesperson in an interview can talk about their achievements, their targets, their revenue, their commission, which if it is, you know, in an exceptional level, that could easily blindside the cultural requirement that's needed in a company because you're looking at success. So for sales specifically, what do you think you should do in order to build out a cultural requirement that puts aside the achievement of revenue, but focuses on the actual cultural balance that you need to join your company?
I mean, for sales organization, the previous track record is like a prerequisite, right? If it's a senior role especially, you do want to have a person who done sales before and were successful. Now, what you look for is like how they done it. So you build your question portfolio around, and also situation and case studies around how would you do it. Because when they walk you through the process, that's when you will know whether that process will fit Bayzat or not. Bayzat, in case of Bayzat, will fit your company. And the more detailed you are able to come up with the open-ended questions, situation-based questions, the more insights you can get in terms of you know, how the person achieved those targets, like how they actually did it. And two is like doing a background check, checking with the previous employer. And I think there I would be very concerned if you are speaking to someone and they have nothing bad to say about the person. I would try to dig and see, okay, what are the like pluses and what are the weaknesses of the person, because everyone has one, and see whether the weaknesses can be compensated by someone else in the team. Or the role can be, you know, tweaked a little bit to compensate those weaknesses or not even focus on them. So yeah, those would be the two things that I would focus on.
And look, I think from a hiring aspect, you can obviously do your due diligence, speak to references, previous companies, etc. What about the effects of the contributor once they're in the company? So, you know, if like most sales organizations, you're under an individual target where you're given your target, you achieve it, you receive your commission. What if, you know, the better performers in your business are just not ingrained in your culture, but are able to perform, especially now in a time where we're working from home, where you're kind of siloed off in your own part of the business? How would culture be required if someone doesn't negatively go against culture, but doesn't ingrain themselves in the culture, but can perform?
I mean, there is no magic bullet, really. I think like it probably, like for me, that decision would be on the scale. You know, how much they are contributing and how kind of little they are contributing in terms of culture. You would have people who are coming from a very different background, right? And for them, it might take time, I mean years, to adopt to your culture. And they obviously wouldn't be, you know, right there when adhering to everything that you want them to be. And you need to give them space. So example of that would be if someone worked in a company for the last 6 years where management never took feedback or never even opened the opportunity to even give feedback without the risk of losing their job. When they move to Bayzat, expecting from them to start giving feedback to their team leader is unrealistic expectation. It will take time and walking slowly and like slowly probing them in order for them to open up and actually do that. So obviously, as long as they are not going against it, as long as they are not gossiping or being frustrated and letting it out all around their teammates and impacting morale, you know, you would work with a person and just like try to walk with them. And then there is another case where person is like great performer, bring a lot into the company, but then putting everyone around them down. And for that one, usually a lot of companies, what they do is they look at the individual performance of that person and they say, well, this person brings this much. But what you should be looking is that person bringing this much and the rest 5 people on the same team as a result of bullying or mistreatment from this person, bringing 50% less. What is more? And once you do that math, you actually realize that you're probably better off changing that person. So yeah, I guess like there's no magic formula. It's more once you know what your culture is, you will be able to answer and say like who needs more time, who needs more space, who needs to be pushed, who needs to be coached, who needs to be trained, and who needs to be replaced.
And I'd imagine your role has probably been very testing over the last 4 to 8 weeks in terms of people working from home, people being comfortable working from home, and then people sort of having to shake off what's been, you know, a crazy change of events to then, you know, start performing. So what have you seen in the culture over the last, well, since COVID has happened, and how do you think your culture will need to be changed if it does as a result of the new normal, should we say?
Yeah, I think like working remotely definitely poses a lot of opportunities and definitely poses some challenges like collaboration, being able to challenge each other when you are in the same room and there is less misunderstanding. What I found challenging within Bayzat is once we entered this the COVID mode, it became increasingly difficult for leaders to give feedback to their members because everything is so sensitive. So you don't, because you don't know what's sensitive, you decide not to give feedback whatsoever, and as a result the member is not performing and you don't really do anything because you are in this mode of I don't know what to do. I don't want to offend them. I don't want them to be more stressed than they already are. So I think that's definitely been challenging. The second one, which I think Bayzat done exceptionally well, is increasing the communication touch points. So it's not really about changing the culture, but like how often and what you communicate and walking the talk. So how what you communicate and what you do being aligned. And there are a lot of initiatives, right? For the sales team, we have sales huddles once a day. So every team has sales huddles every day. Actually, not just sales, every team in the organization has everyday morning huddles. Some team has morning check-ins and morning and evening checkouts of the work to make sure that they bring that collaborative mindset and they also stay on top of all updates. We have a company all hands meeting weekly instead of monthly that we had before. We introduced weekly Q&A with executives. It's not mandatory. Anyone who has questions, they come in for 30 minutes, they can ask their questions, and they can leave on a specific day. And we saw like a good uptake of about 30% of people, different people coming week on week and asking different questions which bothering them or where they would want to have input from the executive team. So yeah, those two would be the kind of the good thing which happened and kind of the challenging thing which happened.
So I think one of the great things there is that I think you've mentioned about 5 or 6 different channels, topics, and ways that people can voice their emotion. Do you feel like it's over communicating, or do you feel that it's completely adequate with what your culture needs to maintain?
I think it's adequate. I don't think you can over communicate it unless people tell you that they are sick and tired of it.
Okay, cool. So we've got a couple of questions for you. Question number one is, would a sales team have a different culture to the rest of the business?
It's a very dangerous place to be, I would say, because the sales team doesn't function in silo. And if they do, that's another problem, because they are not dependent. Even if you have the sales organization in general and your business is very sales heavy, you still have some sort of production operations that those salespeople need to collaborate. So if there is a great mismatch, at the end, your client will suffer, because if those guys can't get along between the teams, eventually it will get into the client, because everything which is being sold is being delivered by a different team. So in reality, there has to be some connection. There might be slight differences, of course, based on the competencies, but I think like if it's complete mismatch, then there is a challenge.
And in terms of building out culture, so if it's something that you've done, or you're seeing that it's not going to plan from what you set out, what do you think are the best things to do if you know culture isn't working?
I think assessing why it's not working. So where is the problem? Is it so? And usually, like the first part is like how the culture was set up. Who created it? Who created the principles you live by, or values? Was it just a nice words that like you took from somewhere, or it actually represents at least like your owner's mindset? And then, you know, so that's number one, really understanding whether it is right culture for you. And the second one is understanding, okay, where does it fail? Like, where does it break? And sometimes you will need to go by, you know, team by team, person by person, and seeing like where is the problem, and then taking some tough decisions. And I know that I have a friend who has a company in UAE, and during the crisis, actually, they would have lost everything. And during that time, they decided to go with the testing for entire company to see like what people's strengths are and whether people are really playing to their strengths. And they realized that a lot of people actually weren't playing to their strengths, and they had to reshuffle certain people. So people who were in production going into sales, and really mixing it up. And as a result of it, they were not just able to survive the crisis in 2029, but also thrive through it. But that required really a bold stand and bold decision from the management, saying that, well, actually, we're gonna try something, knowing that we might fail, because you might fail. So yeah, I think a lot of cultural changes require sometimes bold stands in terms of restructuring, hiring, letting go people who are not serving you, evolving yourself and your leadership team, really changing the way you operate, and walking the talk. And those all are really hard things.
Yes, it's like, I suppose at this specific time, it's like a double-edged sword, because you don't know if taking the risk is going to be worthwhile, but also you sort of, if you're in a position where you need to grow and you don't feel that the team or the culture or the mission of the business is right, then standing still is as dangerous as not taking a risk.
Yeah, I mean, if you're standing still, you're pretty much moving backwards, because the world is moving like forward.
Yes, I think you'll see a lot of companies that are going to take risks that will pay off, or could go, you know, completely the other way. I think we've got another question about hiring. So for those and there's a lot of people, you know, that have unfortunately lost their jobs over the last few weeks. So how do you show a prospective new hiring manager that you can fit within their culture?
Well, firstly, you need to be sure that you know what their culture is, and actually believe that you can fit, and not just say because you need the job. Because then you will. I mean, if you are applying for companies who really talk about culture seriously, they would spot it. So the best place to start is researching about their culture, talking to people within that company. You can reach out on LinkedIn to people who work in the same company, and as long as you don't tell them, how do I get this job, or can you recommend me, when people don't know about you, usually most of the people are very receptive if you ask like some good questions. What is culture like? What is one thing that you really enjoy about this company? What is one thing that is frustrating? How is middle managers are treated? Like, have anyone been promoted in the last couple of years? So really asking to really understand what's going on within the company, because obviously now you can't even see the office, because most of the interviews happening online. So you can't see even how the office setup is, because that one also will give you some indication of how their culture is. Like, does the CEO sit in the special room closed up from everyone else? Does every manager have their special room? Is it open office policy? Does the sales team has like a small cubicles that they can isolate themselves when they are calling? So many things you can see when you enter the office. Now you can't even do that. So reaching out to people, number one, finding information and challenging confirming your assumptions about the culture, and two, asking questions during the interview. I read or I found out that you value this. So let's say if you're applying for Bayzat and you were like, I found out that one of your principles is about feedback. How do you actually practice that? Is it something I can come up to anyone and give feedback? Would I be not fired for this? So you can ask the questions on the interview at the end, and to learn more about.
And I think it can only boost like your internal PR during the interview process of really understanding, what is it like to work at your company, and is it going to be a fit? And I think asking these types of questions, at the moment, if you go on LinkedIn, you're seeing thousands of applicants for jobs. So asking these kind of questions that take a different approach to not just asking about a job, but asking about what is it like to be a success in a company, and what is it like to work for you is really important, because you're gonna see, and it's a sad time, but it's going to be people taking jobs out of desperation and not out of understanding of, is this actually a fit for me and for my potential employer?
But the reality is the companies are a bit the same, right? So there are companies who will hire out of desperation, and there are those companies like that, despite COVID, nothing changed in their hiring process, right? So if they hire, they really will go through the checks and everything. So you probably could get away with those companies who are desperate to get someone, and without thinking about culture too much. But then if you have a solid company to really focus on culture, then you would be caught. So it's better to it's probably good when you're applying to job, to differentiate which company is which and trying to actually find out. Because if you talk to someone and you ask them, how is the culture like? And like, we don't really have culture, we don't talk about it. Then you know your answer.
Yeah. I think moving on to the next part is taking control. So I think, if you haven't been on Bayzat's website before, it's a great website to really understand sort of the initial steps of culture by looking at like your principles, especially if you're a new employee. Or a prospective employee. But I know that, from companies in the UAE, culture isn't documented as well as it should be, or it isn't as apparent as what Bayzat have created. So how do you take control of it? And ultimately, how would you start to build out a culture?
Well, I can share how Bayzat started started doing it. So when I joined Bayzat, I think I was like employee 20 something, probably. We didn't really have a culture. Part of the guys talking, because I think in 3 months before my interview started and when I joined the company, like 15 people joined before me. So there wasn't really many people, a part of owners before that. So we only really started talking about culture when I joined. And I remember the way we try to formulate it in the beginning is simply asking people questions, releasing survey to every member in Bayzat and asking them, you know, what makes you happy to come to the office? What's differentiate Bayzat's workplace from other companies? And then from there, we kind of brainstorm, okay, how does that, like what from those responses we actually want? And we came up with I think 5 values and 3 cultural code, like things that we really, really want to be as a company. And that was the start. And it serves us well, like it really served us well in terms of recruiting people. And since Bayzat went on such a high growth recruitment, it was really helpful. What values didn't help us with is when we reach 100 people, we realize that decision making is still very centralized. Everyone relies on the executive to get the answers. And also we saw some behaviors which we realized is very cultural, but we didn't want them because they were hindering success and progress of Bayzat. So something like debating. It's not normal to debate in UAE. So majority of people we hire are based in UAE. So even though maybe their national culture is different, they adopt to UAE reality very well, and they don't really debate, especially with their manager. And we wanted to challenge that. So I think that's where we thought of, okay, we will move from values to principles. So like principle is more dynamic. It gives you a statement of how you should be behaving versus the value you should have. And that helped us to move to the next stage. So that's experience that I have in terms of witnessing how Bayzat done it through and kept evolving culture and still keep evolving culture till this day, adding another principle this year to kind of fit the context of this year.
And how important were the opinions and thoughts of like the junior members? Because you said there, like it was decision making was sort of executive led, which is a common practice here. But with building up culture, how important was thinking about the person that potentially has not joined Bayzat, but from day one will be immersed in this culture? And how did you leverage on the junior members of your company?
So in terms of like in the beginning, when we were talking about values, like we did ask every member in the survey. So the results came from them. So that was easy to kind of comprehend. When we moved to principles, there was a task force. So there was about 15 members from Bayzat at different level. I was part of the task force and I was not even in the leadership team back then. So different position, different levels, people who kind of adhere more to and stand more for Bayzat. We were on a task force to kind of debating the description of principles, what we want to achieve with them, how we see the change, etc. So it was a collaborative process, which I think, yeah, like you probably, sometimes you don't have to involve everyone, but you do need to involve your key players.
So you moved from values to principles. What was the reason behind that?
Values are more static. It's basically whether you have it or you don't, in a way. Principle is more dynamic. It's something that you can always strive for, and you can always develop. So a value of being like honesty is the value, right? So being honest as a person, that's a value. And we used to have that. And in a very early stages, and it changed like through time. Now, having tough conversations, that's a principle, you know, valuing debate over consensus, that's also principle. That prompts you for action. So if you see something wrong, you are prompt to give feedback. If you disagree with someone or you have a different opinion, you're prompt to debate. With honesty, it was not as visible, but in essence, those represent kind of the same thing.
And being homing in on like the honesty and the value debate over consensus in sales, in sales, from my experience, you've got a lot of different characters, personas, people that are happy to talk to you as blunt and blatant as you want. And you might have people that are a bit more reserved. So on being transparent, which is, it's just fantastic, the fact that you want to resolve issues and not gossip. How has that principle been adopted, and do you think it's working to the way you want it, rather than being a very dramatic principle that isn't being used in the way that you want?
In terms of the debate, value debate or consensus?
Yeah.
I think you need to understand what you are okay to debate and what is undebatable. So, for example, when the team leader comes to the sales team beginning of the month and say your target has been increased, you can debate a lot of things, but the reality is this is something that we have to do in order to survive as a business. So as long as your reason why you're doing it, it's not because you are doing it from the good intention. You can debate, but some of the decisions will not be changed. But giving a chance for that debate to happen really helps. And also being transparent of why this decision took place also helps. That doesn't mean that some people will not be pissed. They will be. And it doesn't mean that everyone will jump on that and say, oh yeah, now I agree, I'm fully on board. But you move on and you execute. So yeah.
And what about from peer to peer? Have you ever seen any issues or concerns with peers debating or being as transparent as you'd like?
Culturally, it sometimes is really hard for people to debate. Confrontation in general is really hard. So no, it's not always easy. It doesn't always happen as you wish, as written in the principle in the booklet. And I think here the role of a leader is plays a key role. How do you encourage that, right? If you have, let's say you have a sales coaching group call, and then you discuss some demo meeting, and everyone just sharing the positive feedback because they're too scared or they're too nice to confront the person who did the call and say, actually, that wasn't great. It's the role of the leader to prompt and ask questions to make sure that people open up and start actually saying what they think, rather than what's nice to say about the other person.
Okay. So moving into our final topic. So I suppose looking at good cultural practice, what examples would you give of good cultural practice, and what challenges have you had in a result of creating a good cultural practice?
I think this is a difficult one because every culture, right? So you adopt practices which fits your culture, not other way around, because something it wouldn't work, right? If you, let's say, you don't value transparency in your company, nothing is transparent, and suddenly you're like, oh, having weekly town halls is good practice. You start having them and they about nothing. So then it's better not having them all together if there is something that you can't share or discuss about them. I think for us, for Bayzat, having weekly all hands meeting, it was really important shift. And two, in order for us to practice the total transparency, really walking the talk with that. So publishing our annual, quarterly, and monthly goals as a company for every department, so any member can go and read it. That's one. A lot of companies wouldn't do it, especially since there are some financials involved in there. Two, when there are some decisions which are distressing taking place, we always do, well, not always, try to do the Q&A session with executives to make sure that everyone has can address their rage or how upset they are, and it's all done in open forum. If we have a Q&A with executives, there is no skipped questions, no matter how uncomfortable they are. And I think that's something I really respect about the executive team at Bayzat, that there had never been a skipped question, no matter how tough it was to answer some of them. And there were times at Bayzat that you would think like, I have no idea how they're gonna answer this. So that what worked with Bayzat culture. That what I found was good. In terms of like what I've seen, there are many things, like many good examples out there. You know, people are caring more about the mental health of their employees and giving extra days off just for them to take care of themselves. That's a good practice if that's what you value. The well-being of your employees is important to you, and that's like at the core. There is another company where I worked before. Cost saving was really important, was one of their values, that we spend wisely, and it really they did their due diligence before they spent anything. Not because they didn't have money, very profitable multi-million-dollar business, but because they valued to take the right decisions with their money. And it didn't really make people upset or because they knew when they joined that this is what we value, which means that if you're going on a business trip, you look for the cheapest flight, not for the most expensive, for the convenience. And yeah, you stayed if you adhere to it, to the culture.
I think like just going back to what Bayzat have done and what you said about giving days off, focusing on mental health, I think the way that you've really sort of humanized how to help with the current teams and how to help with the current challenges, because it is so unique in terms of the first half of the year. It's very commendable that you can sort of rip up the old script of how to deal with people and treat every situation in a sort of unique way. What would you say now for the second half of the year, right? So, if we're bucketing most companies in a case where the first half of the year hasn't been great, there is, there's a sort of feeling where it's like we're about to start a race and it's about whoever jumps out of the traps quickest will win. From a cultural standpoint, that could be at risk by the messaging, or it could be damaged by the nature of how important the second half of the year is. So what advice would you give if you're either changing your culture or introducing let's say a temporary culture specific to the second half of the year?
I would say prioritize, like number one thing, focus on one thing only. We have a tendency in our heads to overcomplicate things and say, oh, I want this and this and this and that. And that's just not going to happen in 6 months out of the crisis, or ever, even in the best case scenario. So I always like to ask the question, what's the one thing that will move the needle for your company? What is one thing? You don't have to form it in the beautiful statement of the culture, but maybe that one thing is something really small, and that's the only thing you do till the end of the year. And for some companies might be something big and drastic, for some might be something small, for some might be a quick fix that you will immediately see results, for some it might be a long process. But that question, what's one thing? And you can sit with the executive team, you can brainstorm about that, but then picking only one thing. That's important.
Cool. Thanks, Tania. We've got just final Q&A. If anyone's got any questions, any final questions for Tania before we go? Don't think so. Okay. Tania, thank you so much. I think it's been really great to understand, how your involvement in principles has really changed the culture of Bayzat and the way that, the communication has really been a big factor on the company not moving out of this position in a drastic scenario is something that you drove home really, really well. And I think, for culture, it is about being open. It is about having a common drive that goes from top down. And I think from the examples you've given today, it's really been apparent in your company. So good work.
Thank Liam. Thank you for inviting. It was a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you very much. So that's coming to the end of the huddle, guys. Finally, we'd like to ensure that you help grow the KinFitz and Co community. I think we've seen some great success over the last couple of weeks with people coming into the community, being involved and asking for help from one another. And it will only continue to grow if you can help. So, there are a lot of salespeople that unfortunately aren't in a position at the moment. I think from what we're seeing and from the conversations we're having that, the market is picking up, but the candidate market is going to be fierce with people looking for jobs. So if we can help anyone, give them advice, if we can help with any specific roles as and when they come onto our website, it would be great to help people. And also likewise to grow the community and to ask questions on a day-to-day basis through our social media channels is something that, is a testament to the people that have joined and helped with the growth of KinFitz and Co sales community. So please keep doing that if possible. And if you think someone may need our help or services, do get them in touch with us. So thank you very much for everyone's time today. I hope we have a great week ahead. We'll put up our next guest in a couple of days. And then it will be moving on to the second half of June. So for those that are in the deep end of your Q2 target, I hope it's going well. And for those in the middle of the month, you need to be getting around 35 to 40% by the end of the week. So I hope it goes well. But thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon and a great week. And we'll see you again next time. Thank you.